All right, pre-AP biology students. Today, I want to give you guys a small lecture, maybe 10, 15 minutes long or so, on the characteristics of life. So we've been studying, the scientific method for like a week or two, and we're kind of ready to move on to some actual, biology related topics that are kind of outside of the realm of the scientific method. So we're going to start off today with this picture, or these three pictures. Obviously, one is of some pink flamingos. In the middle, we have some Venus flytraps, which are kind of unique types of plants. And obviously, on the right, we have a gorilla. So, today's theme or topic, I guess, is really what do all of these living things have in common? Including ourselves, I suppose, too. So every living thing, shares a certain set of characteristics, and that's sort of what we're going to go after today and try to understand, what those characteristics are. Now, as we go through this, some of you are at home, and I'm going to have some students listen to my lecture at school over this. I am going to provide everybody with a hard copy, kind of a fill in the blank note page or note sheet that you can fill in as you watch this lecture or listen to it. That way, you'll have some notes to study from for our next quiz. Our next quiz will cover this topic as well as a couple of others as well. So make sure you do get those notes taken. All right, so let's start off today um, with kind of a definition, I suppose, of what biology is, and then we'll kind of get into what characteristics all living things share. So again, from your root word list, bio means life. Ology means the study of. So obviously, biologists are people who study living things. But the thing about biology is there's a lot of different branches. There's lots of different sort of side avenues that you could take if you want to study, specific types of life. For example, microbiologists, they study small things like microbes and bacteria and things like that. Botanists, they're people who study plants. Zoologists study animals. Marine biology, the study of underwater life. Genetics, study of DNA, genes, and heredity. Pathology, you might remember path. That's one of your root words, means disease. So a pathologist, for example, might study the coronavirus or any organisms that might end up causing diseases. So um, again, lots of different branches of study when it comes to biology. All right, organisms can be influenced by other things in their environments. So when it comes to a living thing, I want us to understand a couple different terms here. One's called a biotic factor, and one's called an abiotic factor. Biotic factors are, living things in the environment that affect other living things. So if, for example, a shark eats a seal, then the shark is affecting the seal, and the seal is affecting the shark too, I guess, because the seal provides food for the shark. So those are biotic things. Living things, plants, animals, microbes, funguses, whatever. They're all biotic. They're living things in the environment. Abiotic factors are non-living things that have an impact or an effect on living things. For example, the temperature of water, that has an impact on the living things that live in the water, right? If the temperature gets too warm, then that can have an impact on life. Soil, is an abiotic factor. Temperature, water, wind is an abiotic factor. Anything that's not living that can affect living things is an abiotic factor. All right, so back to our kind of conversation about what characteristics living things share. So again, we talked about the gorilla versus the flamingo versus the Venus flytrap. Here's a hippopotamus. Here's a toucan. I think we're getting an idea that there's a pretty big diversity of living things on this planet. But again, all living things do share specific characteristics. And we're going to talk about 8 of these characteristics today. And in order for something to be alive, it really does have to have all 8 of these characteristics. I mean, it has to be a living thing. So if it's missing these, then it's not going to be considered a living thing. There are things that do have some of these characteristics, but they don't have them all. So we're not going to count them as being alive. So, for example, here's our first characteristic: all living things are composed of cells. I'm trying to find the perfect place to put my face. Let's put me up here. Okay. Um, when it comes to cells, you've probably studied cells in biology class and or not biology class, but in middle school science. So we're going to study cells a lot in this class. But I use this statement a lot. It says you are alive because your cells are alive. In your body's made up of brain cells and blood cells and stomach cells and kidney cells and all these different types of cells, but those are living things. They are the smallest working unit of a living thing. This picture here at the bottom, or these are actual nerve cells here on the left. These are red blood cells. You'll notice that they look completely different. And that's because they have completely different functions. These on the right, these are plant cells. So, I mean, every different type of cell is kind of unique. Some organisms are what we call multicellular, like us, for example. We're a multicellular organism. Hippopotamuses and toucans and gorillas and flamingos and Venus flytraps, they're all multicellular organisms. Some organisms are unicellular, which means that they only have one cell. Bacteria, right, are your prototypical unicellular organisms. There's a term here is called biogenesis. Remember our roots again. Bio is life. Genesis is the beginning of or the start of. I like this statement here. It says all cells come from pre-existing cells. So, for example, every cell that makes up your body, like all trillion cells or whatever it is, every one of them came from another cell. I mean, everybody started off as one cell, right? Sperm and egg come together, they form a zygote, and that's kind of the original cell that you all form from. And eventually that cell divides into 2, into 4, into 8, and eventually 9 months later, a baby's born. But every cell comes from a pre-existing cell. Another way to say that is life comes from life. So a living cell comes from another living cell. There is one exception to that, which is kind of an interesting topic, and we'll talk about it a little bit down the road, second semester. But um, where did the first cell come from? That's kind of the one exception to the rule of biogenesis. There's some theories out there. We'll talk about some theories about where the first cell may have came from and how it could have formed. But again, nobody was around to actually see the first cell form. We just have to use science and scientific evidence to kind of help us understand how that came about. Another term here is called spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation is the theory that life came from non-living things. Now we know that that's not true today. We know that, like for example, your pencil can't turn into a whale. That's ridiculous, right? But again, the idea of like where the first cell came from, this theory of spontaneous generation actually has some weight to it. We'll talk about that again a little bit more down the road. But I want you to understand these two terms, biogenesis and spontaneous generation. All right, the next characteristic: all living things have the ability to reproduce. Reproduction involves passing genes or DNA to the next generation of offspring. When it comes to um, reproduction, I think maybe we have some um, maybe inkling that there are different types of reproduction. This year in this class, we will look at both of these terms a lot more in depth and understand more about them. But just in general, today, I just want you to kind of know just the basic difference between the two. Asexual reproduction, like for example, bacteria. Okay, they're kind of notorious asexual reproducers. It only requires one individual. So you only need one bacteria to reproduce. But the offspring, the next generation, is exactly the same as the previous generation. So you really don't get any change from one generation to the next. Whereas a sexual organism or organisms that reproduce sexually, obviously there's two individuals that are involved, but the offspring are different from the parents. So, like these panda bears, for example, if they have a baby, the baby will be genetically different from the mom and the dad. They won't be exactly the same. And that's the truth with most living things. Most living things do reproduce sexually, and we'll talk about some advantages of this type of reproduction versus asexual. I mean, there's a reason why most living things on the planet do reproduce sexually. It does have some advantage, and we will get into that down the road. But just for right now, just know the difference between the two, sexual and asexual. All living things use energy or require energy from their surroundings. This is called metabolism. It's a big vocab word. I mean, every living thing has to eat, it has to get food. A shark obviously eats differently than a plant would, right? I mean, plants don't have teeth, they don't have a stomach, they don't have mouths, but they do require energy. They require some type of food. So, a couple of terms here. The term heterotrophic, maybe you've heard that before. It's otherwise known as a consumer. These are organisms that have to obtain food from another organism. So a shark eating a seal, that'd be a classic example of a heterotrophic organism or a consumer. Whereas an autotrophic organism or a producer can produce their own food, typically through photosynthesis. There's some other ways that organisms can make food. The photosynthesis is kind of the big one. So that's how plants make sugar. It's called glucose, and that's what they use as a fuel source, as an energy source. So every living thing needs energy. It's just how do they obtain the energy? How do they get it? That's kind of the difference between one organism and the next. I mean, a shark obtains energy differently than, let's say a flamingo would. They're animals, but they obtain things a little bit different. All living things grow and develop. There is a difference between the two. The term grow just means to get bigger. Every living thing will get bigger. I mean, this little baby sea turtle here, right, is going to get bigger. This plant here, it's going to get bigger. Develop means to change as you grow. So, like, for example, they take you, for example. I mean, think about when you were 2 years old, if you have a baby picture of yourself or something, versus now, let's say you're 14, 15 years old now. I mean, obviously, you've all grown. You've gotten bigger since you were two, but you've also changed as you grow, right? I mean, people are notorious for going through puberty and going through changes, and that's kind of what happens as we grow. The sea turtle here, same thing. I mean, it's going to grow and it's going to change as it grows. Same thing with the plant. The plant's going to grow and change as it grows as well. So, growing and developing are kind of two different things that we sort of throw them together in the same category. All living things must maintain a constant internal environment. All right, this is kind of a big term, but I want you to remember it. We're going to talk about it a lot this year. It's called homeostasis. Homeostasis. Homeostasis is basically making sure that the inside of your body is kind of regulated. For example, your heart rate, right? I mean, if you were to, swim a mile, or run or ride a bike or play football or whatever, your heart rate's going to go up, right? But then after you're done for a while, your heart rate comes back down again, right? But that's all controlled by your brain, really. So, but it's homeostatic. It's the way your body kind of maintains its internal environment. Your blood sugar, right? If you were to go and eat a whole bag of Skittles right now, I guarantee you that your blood sugar would go up. But your blood sugar can't stay up because if it does, it's actually toxic to your blood. So your body has to regulate and kind of maintain that blood sugar. Your blood sugar is always going up and coming down. It's going up and coming down, but it has to be maintained at a certain level. Okay, and if we're having trouble with that, then we can become diabetic or hypoglycemic or things like that. So that's a really important thing. Your body temperature goes up and comes down, goes up and comes down, but it has to be maintained right at 98.6 degrees or whatever our normal body temperature is. It actually varies from person to person, but those are all good examples of homeostatic mechanisms. Number 6, all living things consist of organic compounds. Okay, organic compounds, what you have to, there's a lot of chemistry in this. I'm not even going to touch it really. I'm going to just briefly talk about it. But when you take chemistry class next year or AP chemistry down the road, we even offer a class at the high school. It's called organic chemistry, right? Organic biochemistry. But what you kind of need to know for this class is that organic compounds are carbon based. Okay. This picture over on the right here, okay, you see this kind of big chemical structure. This is glucose, which is also known as plant sugar. But you'll notice that you got all these atoms like carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, right? But you see all these carbons are all kind of linked together in this big long chain, and they're bonded to these hydrogens and some oxygens. This is kind of a hallmark of what an organic compound is. If you see these like chains of carbon, the carbon bonded to hydrogen and oxygen, that's pretty much what an organic compound is. I mean, there's a lot, but there are lots of organic compounds. This is just one example. But carbon bonded to hydrogen, that's kind of a hallmark. So you just kind of make sure you sort of can recognize that. Oh, what happened to my screen here? Let's back to where we were. We did all that. We did 3, we did 4, we did 5. Yeah, here we go. One thing I do want you to know, and we'll talk a lot more about this down the road, is that there are typically 4 kind of classes of organic compounds that are found in living things. Proteins, you've probably heard of proteins before. Okay, we have to eat protein, right? That's an important thing. Carbohydrates, there's another one. You've heard of these two before. Another one is called lipids or fats. And then the final one is called a nucleic acid. And a really good example of a nucleic acid is DNA, which is found in every living thing. But each one of these are kind of unique types of organic compounds. So I'm making a video. Go away. All right, I'll be up there in a little bit. Sorry. Family must go eat dinner. Anyway, we're almost done. So make sure we know the names of these 4 things. We'll get into them more in depth in a couple of weeks. But for right now, just know that those are organic compounds that are found in living things. All right, number 7. As a group, species of living things can evolve or change over time. This one's a little bit hard, I think, for kids to understand at the beginning of the school year. The word evolve means changing over time. And in biology, time usually means millions of years, like long periods of time. We have a fossil record. We'll talk about the fossil record this year. But we can trace ancestors of organisms back, millions and millions of years. And we can actually look at these changes in their fossils and see how organisms have changed over time, including humans. So we'll talk a little bit about human evolution this year. But again, as a group, like, for example, rhinoceroses. Rhinoceroses are a group of organisms, and they have changed. If you look at rhinoceroses, 5 million years ago, they were different looking than what they are today. I mean, there's been 5 million years of time that's gone by. I don't think it's very far-fetched to think that, organisms have gone through, sometimes small changes, sometimes very big changes, depending on some of the circumstances that have kind of driven those changes. But again, the word evolve or evolution just strictly means a changing over time. As a group, living things can do that. All right, the last one here today that I want to talk about is responding to a stimulus. All living things have this ability to respond to things in their environment. Whether it be like, you shivering if you get cold, right? That would be you responding to a stimulus. The cold would be a stimulus to you, right? It could be a plant, growing towards light. That would be a plant responding to a stimulus. But every living thing can do that. It just depends on what the stimulus is and how they're actually responding to it. But every living thing can do that. All right, so today we talked about 8 characteristics of living things, as well as a couple other things like the definition of biology and things like that. Again, make sure you do get these notes copied down. I will have a hard copy for you when you return to class, or if you were in class today, you would have already received that. All right, kids, have a good day. I will see you soon.